off-decide method center. The webinar originally scheduled today will actually be held on November 17th. There was last-minute rescheduling of the University of British Columbia and the co-director of Research and Evidence Development for the British Columbia Ministry of Health Services, who will talk about self-controlled or case-only designs. Dr. Maclure?
Thank you. And I'm just going to, I should this in advance, which is to get the right pen size for the printer. Maybe I'll use a pencil here. Good, that's better. So, you see my affiliations there, and I will disclose that some of this work has been funded by a research grant from Health Canada. Also, when I keep, I'm not no industry ties, and so the work was funded by Sentinel from the FDA. And the outline of the what is the research question? Why self-controlled designs effectively mean case-only designs with some caveats. Now into a pictorial review of case-only designs. Touch on some ideas that I've colorfully stars and stripes for graphing drug use, and one version of which is a spreadsheet, and then some variations of patient timelines and the importance of looking at almost data. History is the past 2 decades. This crossover study, we were doing interview with myocardial infarction patients, and I wondered how it would work out in when applied to databases. Suisse was among the pioneers of that, and also around 1995, Farrington proposed the self-controlled case series, which we'll touch upon. And I've had it took me years to have the privilege of working with some data in the research Canadian databases. Even though I've been exposed to data, I've only recently started using them with case-only design. Here's how I first looked at it as a kind of checkerboard where the myocardial infarction happens on one day, and the trouble was how to find out a control that wasn't founded or by selection bias. My first idea was that we could, if we're looking at why this person had their MI on say Tuesday, we could interview a myocardial infarction patient who had their MI on Wednesday, and because they made it through Tuesday. And that was the beginnings of the idea, but of course it wasn't long before I thought, well, wait a second, we could also use the same person as their own control. Subsequently, it became clear to me that we've actually got a different research questions, slightly different. And if you were in a car crash and you just bump into the car in front of you on your way to work, and you might say to yourself, "Oh, why is it always me?" Or you'd say, "Oh, why now?" So they're slightly different questions: why then, and why them. They may be addressing the same underlying pharmacological issue. For example, why is it because I took this one of the nights that I had a benzodiazepine, or is it because I'm a regular benzodiazepine user? Those are 2 slightly different research questions with similar underlying causal hypothesis. In the original interview study, we used timelines like this to record data. We also asked questions in several different ways, and essentially they have have maybe the myocardial infarction happen down here, and we would say, what were you doing in the hours before and the days before? And so there was a variety of windows that were possible for you choose this as a case window and a matching window the day before, or you could use hours before, or you could use all the usual frequency, lots of options. And so I like to say that the easy part, at least in the interview study, was what were you doing just before, and the hard part was to figure out how usual was that using past information. In the last year, working with the Sentinel on trying to be even more clear than in the past, I suggested that in ways a only design is simply a highly stratified cohort analysis. Each person is their own stratum. And that approach was taken in a study done in Denmark by Fosbol et al. Using 1 million Danes, and they got the kinds of ratios that we have come to see associated between myocardial infarction and the COX-2 selective anti-inflammatories. Interestingly, they did a case crossover analysis, but it wasn't mentioned in the abstract. Maybe somebody asked, maybe a reviewer asked them to do it. What's interesting is to think about when you're in so they're kind of complementary. So here are their results for the cohort and for the case crossover. We'll see those plotted against each other in a second. But it's interesting to think about that in cohort you are kind of interested in long-term chronic use, and so you're interested in chronic continuous users. And intermittent users are something of a contaminant. It's like in a randomized trial where people are non-adherent. On the other hand, in a case crossover or a self-controlled case series study, you need to be intermittent. You need to be crossing over. So these two subpopulations are essentially contribute in different ways to these two analyses. So you can see that the research question, or the underlying one about whether these medications trigger refers to triggering of the heart attack. The cohort can address the longer-term causation. So there's slight differences in underlying mechanisms being considered, slight differences in the representativeness of the population, and so forth. In order to come up with a dramatic example, and I use this example because the authors of this paper shifted. They presented both of these results, but their totals, the population in the table were identical, suggesting to me that they had not realized that they're shifting. When you shift to a case crossover analysis, you're shifting to a subset of the population that is crossing back and forth, and so you might want to be using different totals in your tables. An extreme example to illustrate that was to say if you did a cohort analysis of the role of gender on the risk of myocardial infarction, and then you said, okay, that gives me a relative risk of what something I'm familiar with. Now we do a case crossover. The subjects in your case crossover analysis would be restricted to those who had changed their sex. They were very unusual unusual subset of the population and a very small number. So that's an extreme example to illustrate what's going on here. This slide shows that when we plot the ratio estimates from the previous slide, we see that there were positive associations for high-dose ibuprofen and high-dose naproxen in the cohort analyses that didn't appear in the case crossover analysis. And that, to me, is a sign of confounding by indication in high-dose category, because I think we're pretty, we've got an amount of evidence. Anyway, it could be the opposite. It could be that high doses trigger, or for these medications trigger, but it does show that yet slightly different hypotheses being addressed in these two types of analyses. So that dealt with the research question. Now, a few slides that address why self-controlled self-controlled analyses essentially are case only. Well, you know of crossover experiments, and those experiments people serve as their own controls. And here I've just shown a simple crossover experiment with outcomes shown as red squares. Here we have a total of with involving 6 people one who were exposed first and then unexposed, and half that are unexposed first and then exposed. And did a mental. Then look at the data. Here's the data, the table for the first person, the table for the second person, and they're going to do a Mantel-Haenszel analysis of these, and they show that some of these cases would, well, we'll get to that in a second. One of the points here is that when we an inception cohort study, and this was a concern for the mini Sentinel. It did a self-controlled design in an inception cohort where the exposure to the new medication was continuous. Eventually, we would be restricted to this subset of the population, and that would have a problem in a case crossover analysis. So here you see a whole bunch of there's the first user to start using the medication, and they use it continuously. There's the second user, they use it continuously, and so on. Crossover analysis among people who had heart attacks, M referring to the MI, and this person would be concordant unexposed. All of these people here would be concordant, and both the concordant unexposed and the concordant exposed would drop out, and the only persons left in the analyses would be these discordant time exposed. So there's a bias in the design when there's a very sharp, there's a non-steady state where there's a new drug being introduced, and when people are starting and stopping, so that there's sort of, and it's become more of a steady state, then there will be the opposite kind of discordant subjects will begin to emerge, and that bias won't occur. This is the data that we were looking at here in Canada, and you did a cases only analysis of our case crossover study, and we found elevated risks or odds ratios in that analysis, and I think that's sign of the phenomenon that I just showed you, that we need to focus on the steady state in a dynamic population for the case crossover analysis. Here is just back to, that was a bit of a tangent about inception cohorts. Now back to why a controlled, self-controlled design ends up being a case-only design. So we apply the Mantel-Haenszel estimate to the tables that I showed you earlier, and you see that when there's the fifth person had a 0, no events in their first part of their interval, and here's somebody who had 0 events in their unexposed period. This person's is their exposed period. This is their unexposed period. Those drop out calculation. So, in general, if they drop out of. Let me go back. They drop out of the numerator and the denominator, but every person in that, this person number 1, every person contributed some information. So if we go to the next slide, we see that if person is serving as their own control and they never became a case, that they had no events, then they contribute nothing to the numerator and nothing to the denominator of the Mantel-Haenszel estimate. And so that shows why self-controlled ends up being restricted to case only. Add a caveat, because I'll get to in a second. If a person was only ever exposed, they never crossed over, so they were overexposed and they never were unexposed, or vice versa, they were only ever unexposed and they never were exposed, then again they contribute nothing to the Mantel-Haenszel estimate. Just a short tangent to say that design that we'll come back to, this is Sammy Suisse's contribution, you can use non-cases as controls in the usual type of case control analysis, and then do a crossover analysis within the controls to control for trend analysis. So this is what I called the caveat. So here is a self-controlled part of the case time controlled design is a self-controlled analysis among non-cases to control for trends. But in general, self-controlled means case only. Here's another way of looking at it. You can see that I showed before. Well, you're familiar with the matched pair analysis. The matched concordant matched pairs don't contribute information to the analysis. The analysis is restricted to the ratio of the B discordance to the C discordance. And what does that mean in the case crossover analysis? Is that continuously exposed people drop out, and continuously non-exposed cases drop out. So also that can be seen in the usual frequency. This is the table for usual frequency analysis. The other was using a matched day or a matched hour or a matched interval, same duration. Here we can look short case window, a long control window, and of per time, and see what the ratio is between the exposed and the unexposed person time, and compare that with the the exposure odds in the window just before the incident. That's what the analysis of that would be. That's that individual's contribution of person time. I'm just going to erase some of these things. There we go. And we can see once again that if a person never crosses over, they don't contribute to the analysis. A really short tangent on usual frequency analysis. It never occurred to me, somebody else pointed it out, that there is a kind of length bias in the crossover analysis. If you just like from screening, we know that when you screen, you tend to get longer intervals. I like to use a fork and a spaghetti model analogy because we all had the experience of pulling longer noodles out first and being stuck with the short ones at the end of dinner. These authors pointed out that there's a slight negative bias from the usual frequency analysis, or a potential bias from this length bias selection, but it doesn't apply to matched analyses. We're moving to the part 3, which is pictorial explanations of the different case-only self-controlled designs. I've already seen this, how I originally viewed this design. When I heard about the self-controlled case series, I was a little bit that I had not thought of extending it to the cohort situation. You can line up. Here's the case crossover analysis. Time 0 is the onset of the outcome, and you focused only on the time before, because after you've had myocardial infarction, all kinds of your exposures would change. So it was unidirectional. We reschedule, shift these timelines back and forth until they were lined up with the last exposure. The exposure could be set as time 0, or could set as time 0 the first exposure, an inception cohort. And it's these lined up by exposure is what the distinctive feature of the controlled case series. You don't even need to line it up by exposure. Thinking of it in your mind as a cohort design is what the self-controlled case series approach is, which we'll see in a second. Before we get there, I'll say something that's common to both designs is the head dependence on assumptions about the duration of the exposure's effect. So if you looked at this and you calculated an exposure odds ratio, and then somebody came along and says, "Oh, your model for how long the drug has an effect, you've got the half-life quite wrong. It's only half of that." You can see that would change your exposure odds ratio by a factor of 2. So duration is very important, and some slide refers to some of the challenges of what window to look at and how do you define it. It's related. The window will be related to the maximum individual induction in the time in the population and the minimum individual induction time population. For vaccine studies, this kind of information, there's some pretty strong biological reasoning for coming up with minimum and maximum induction times. And for drugs, it seems to be a lot harder to come up with those. The distinction between the two types of self-controlled designs is directionality. I've already showed you that the case crossover as initially proposed was unidirectional. People working in air pollution proposed and named it as a bidirectional case crossover. Okay, because if this is, well, actually it's kind of interesting thinking of the relationship between air pollution and car accidents. I never thought of that until now. But clearly, whether you're looking at hospitalizations for asthma or something, there's no reverse causation. Asthma is not influencing atmospheric conditions, so you can look at you can use a future person time in a study of environmental air pollution because the future person time is not affected by the occurrence of the illness. But in a lot of our health studies, the outcome influences future exposure. And so this issue of directionality is an advantage. Bidirectional study is an advantage if you're concerned about exposure time trends, which in evolution studies, of course, they're dealing with seasonal trends. In drug safety studies, we're dealing with marketing trends, where the growth of the use of the drug means people in the future are likely to be more exposed than people in the past. So directionality is attractive, but it has this downside of immortal time bias, which we'll see in a second. So most crude type of self-controlled design is called the sequence symmetry analysis, and you pick one of the events. Here is for measles, mumps, and rubella, and these are dates of diagnosis of meningitis, and you can see that there's asymmetry of meningitis diagnoses after the immunization compared to before. So that's a very crude type of self-controlled case series where we're seeing the exposure at time 0, t equals 0. I'm going to go slower here because this is perhaps one of the main take-home ideas. It's got a lot of ideas packed into here, actually. These are two pictures of the same data from the online tutorial on self-controlled case series, and it's vaccine data. It's the measles, mumps, and rubella example. In fact, it's the same data as these ones here. So each of these diagrams, this one and the two diagrams shown here, in the exact same data from 10 children, and over their second year of life, here 365th day up to 703, and there is the date of vaccination, the light blue here. Here, so forth. There's the induction time, the delta between the vaccination, and this in the vaccine safety literature is called the risk period, but I personally prefer to call it the effect period because people are still at risk at other periods. This is the period when you expect an effect of the exposure, increased risk of the outcome. And the yellow is the diagnosis. Now you can see, number one, had their diagnosis before they were immunized. So that's a situation where the outcome occurred before the exposure. And in vaccine safety studies, because the diagnosis had been very close to the time when they were supposed to be immunized. In fact, it might have been. They might have had their immunization postponed because of this event. Some potential for reverse causation bias there, and if this had been a death, instead of that had being a meningitis, they had, or if it had been fatal meningitis, they would have had the opportunity to be exposed. Some potential for time bias in the self-controlled case series as originally proposed. Case crossover version of the same data, time 0 is set as equal to the time of onset of the diagnosis, and only the time before the diagnosis is used to calculate the exposure odds, and so it's a unidirectional design. If depends your situation. If you're concerned about exposure trend bias, but there isn't so much time, so much opportunity because mortality is so low in young children, and because the vaccination is aimed at everybody, the opportunities for reverse causality and immortality bias is really low. But when you get to drugs, especially in the elderly, there's all kinds of problems of reverse causality and immortal time bias. So I think the bidirectional design needs to be avoided. The authors of the Farrington and others have come up with unidirectional self-controlled case series that are a little bit hard to understand, only because they're striving a great deal for to preserve their Poisson modeling. One case to look at here is the last subject who had exposure. So if they were concordant for immunization and retained in the analysis only because they were discordant for age across the age interval, I personally probably would have dropped them from my case crossover analysis. So it shows you a slight differences of the self-controlled case series may include people who have not crossed over on main exposure of interest, but have crossed over on covariates. However, when you look closely at the estimation procedure, I think it's true to say that the only ones who contribute, the child number 10, will not contribute to the point estimate, will not influence the point estimate, might, whoops, I'm stepped beyond my comfort zone. I'm exactly sure how child number 10 contributes to the analysis. There are some empirical results from the, I've forgotten the acronym, Medical Outcomes, I think it might be Omnibus project, comparing self-controlled case series analyses and a case crossover analysis. So this is bidirectional, this is unidirectional, and wedding quite a concordance, but some differences, and they're exploring those further. So we already mentioned this case time control design that uses a control group to help estimate background trend. This is the alternative. If you can't do a bidirectional design because of reverse causation bias or immortal time bias, then, and you are worried about an exposure time trend, then maybe you want to use a non-case group and do a crossover analysis. That gives you an odds ratio that represents the trend in non-cases, and if you divide, actually adjust the odds ratio you see in the cases with the odds ratio you see in the non-cases, better estimate of the relative risk. Really, Wang extended that idea to make it a case time control, so that your controls were sampled not just from the general population but from future cases, and that would provide a better time control. I'm looking at the time and realizing I need to go quickly. Essentially, this is a table that was in the paper that we did for Mini-Sentinel, and we found that when exposure is brief, this was just a reviewing all studies that have been done using these designs, and then kind of ranking the exposures by the accuracy, and it was apparent that when exposure is brief and timing data are accurate, it's better to use the case, the self-controlled case series. At least from, I won't go into details. Among drugs, antibiotics and sometimes anti-inflammatories are used quite briefly, and you can go from dispensing data roughly when people self-administered them. But you get into a variety of other drugs that are used more intermittently, then the self-controlled case series gets more difficult. It sort of stands intuitively, when you have really accurate exposure data, and you're focused on one exposure, it makes sense to orient your whole thinking around that accurate exposure event. But if you've got accurate outcome events and inaccurate exposure events, then it makes sense to shift your design and thinking around the item that is accurately measured, namely outcome, which puts you in the case crossover domain. We did this with methylphenidate, which involves sporadic use, and we were looking at myocardial infarction and other outcomes. And so, as I said earlier, the assumption of the effect period in the induction time is one of the areas of debate and one of the areas of uncertainty in the self-controlled case series. But it's a much smaller uncertainty than when you're dealing with drug dispensing data, because people may space out their use much longer than the intended prescription duration. Or, as before, there's some question about the induction time before the outcome that would. So led me to. I had a flash of stars and stripes, which led me to think, okay, I'm going to skip over some slides and bring this talk to a conclusion. One point being that case crossover designs are better when you're dealing with multiple exposures and one outcome. Vice versa, the self-controlled case series, if you're looking at multiple outcomes of one exposure, it makes sense to use the self-controlled case series. These stripes was just a way of trying to point out that we need to be, I'd love to be able to see use patterns of drugs where we could see how much is sporadic use, how much is continuous, how much is intermittently continuous. how much inception cohort or in a case crossover study, what does it look like, and how do those things vary when we make assumptions? And I just want to finish the final point of a bunch of these slides, which is that here's what you'd like to see in a case crossover analysis. Somebody exposed during the case window, unambiguously exposed, and here's a control who's unambiguously exposed in the control window. So there's two ways of doing the analysis. One is to design your window in a way that's broader and you don't have to worry as much about the stripe, or you put much more emphasis on trying to understand what's happening in the stripe. Your definition of windows, if you choose a broader window for thinking of the stripe, you can, if somebody who was a discordant subject can become concordant and vice versa. So quite a bit of thought on the duration of the effect is necessary. So I'm going to just finish off by flipping through these data pictures. Here's an actual spreadsheet of our analysis, where each thin line is when the people were exposed. These are the cases. These are exposed in the control window. Well, cases, but you can see that just by visualizing it, that there's very little association between the exposure and the outcome, because these areas are the same. Can vary your assumptions about the stripe and watch the analysis change. Final take-home message of this presentation is that you really need to look at the pattern in database studies. One of the beauties of these self-controlled designs is you can look at a picture and see both the case window and the control window. You can see a story. This is one patient. You can see when they're over a period of 2 years, and see what was happening. You can see the importance of the stripes. Here's somebody who was seemingly not exposed to this drug, but if you take into account a fairly long stripe, they might have been concordant when you were treating them as discordant. And you also find out, by the way, that also has to be done with confounder drugs, making the analysis considerably more complicated. When you present the data like this, you can see stories of people who had sudden events, and times when they completely disappeared from the data. That was probably a hospitalization. Yeah, it was a hospitalization, and their drug data disappeared, because our drug data comes only from communities, not from hospitals. You wonder where this person was. Where was this person? So looking at the raw data in a self-controlled case series is more informative than in a regular cohort study, because you've got the case and the control period shown. So that's my final take-home message, and I'm now open to questions.
Great. Thank you very much, Malcolm. I'd like to invite anyone to ask questions about the design.
Hi, Alan Ellis at UNC. One of the things you mentioned was online tutorial. I see there's a mini Sentinel report online about case-based designs, and I'm curious about the tutorial. Or other resources.
If they've got a tutorial on the website for the self-controlled case series, if you Google it, it should come up. They're based at the Open University. Heather Whitaker wrote it up, and it was published in Statistics in Medicine.
I wasn't sure if it was the same thing.
Yep.
So those two look like good resources. Are there other places you would suggest looking for those interested in learning more about these designs?
I feel that it's about time I had my own website on case crossover, but you'll have to wait for a few months for that.
All right, it's John again. I had a question. I was thinking about when you were talking about the non-inception cohort, sort of the steady state prevalent use cohort. And one of the reasons we do inception cohorts is that we want to sort out some of the issues of survival bias or reasons people stay on drugs relative to starting them. And I was just wondering if those issues have been thought through in that setting, or what your take be on that.
If I go back to the picture, maybe I'll be able to think about it more clearly. So, in a steady state, there's lots of potential for confounding by indication within the so let's say that this person actually stopped other MI, or actually the number 2 was actually unexposed when they had their event. So there's plenty of concern about with the person confounding by indication or contraindication, but sometimes for certain outcomes, when it's more milder outcomes, or maybe people just feel there's no connection between the two drugs, and therefore they continue to take them intermittently despite outcomes. It'd be feasible to do self-controlled designs, including the case unidirectional case crossover. One of the things that I discovered, I wanted to mention that looking through the raw data I was doing near the end generates hypotheses such as, once mentioned, what's this person doing completely absent from the population, or are they in the hospital, or what's going on? So those are some mundane hypotheses, but I also was surprised that I hadn't really thought as clearly about the fact that certain types of medications will be dispensed because the person happens to be going to the pharmacist or the physician to renew something else, or because they go in for a problem related to something else, they say, oh, and by the way, can you also renew my prescriptions? You get these clusters of medication renewals that are obviously only due to one thing, one other thing, and so it's a kind of causation that I hadn't thought of before, namely the convenience of going to the physician and the drugstore when you get an outcome related, a completely unrelated outcome outcome that's going to cause you to have a prescription, you then renew other prescriptions. So that occurred to me when I was looking at it. I was thinking, oh, look at this pattern here. Let's see if I can find it. I'll skip down to the end and see if I can look at... I think you can see here. Here's somebody who I'm going to go back. Some people had a lot, but look at this person had some kind of event, and they got a whole bunch of prescriptions at the same time. But I was particularly somewhere along the line, one of these examples, the renewal of their methylphenidate, which were very radically renewed, seemed to coincide with a health event. I thought, oh, anyway, that's a good illustration of the fact that looking at raw data is very informative. Now, you right at the very beginning, the timeline we used in the interview study, and I've always thought, I remember going back to the individual forms and looking at these subjects and saying, well, let me see whether we, just how the interviewer coded this thing. Were they actually in this square or were they in this one? Because it might make a difference to our analysis. And that same kind of, and as I discovered in doing that it has this wonderful advantage of being able to see the control period and the case period at the same time. And when I had a problem with defining whether they are in and out of the interval, I said, so long as I do the same for the control period as the case period, I should be okay. That intuition that you can get a lot from looking at timeline data from individual people came from having worked on interviews where we were actually looking at the forms and looking across exposures during multiple exposures during the few days before their heart attack. Oh, here we have some in the do comments on potential bias that may be induced by limiting analyses to incident cases versus randomly selected events that may be episodic. Well, in cases, in the original study, we looked at incident cases and did not include recurrent MIs. I think that you would be able to use recurrent cases. Just have to do a lot of thinking about it. So I'm afraid I don't have any deep insights. Another question I'm reading out: when do case time control study and calculate the odds ratios for cases and for controls, and then divide to get the correction? Is there a way to calculate the confidence interval? I think just the sum of the you take the logs and use the variance of the logs as you normally would do, and unfortunately that correction factor adds quite a bit of random error to your estimate. So you basically sum the two variances, and then the adjusted estimate has the adjusted estimate has the variance of the sum of the variances of the two components. Let's see, more questions to ask. Are there any special concerns when using multiple control periods? Yes. lots. There's trade-off between it's the usual kind of trade-off. The more trade between precision and unbiased. Usually there's one particular window you feel best about, and then you look at but we're not going to have as much power. Can we use some additional control periods? We, in the study, we had quite a few. It was partly related to my worry that the design was going to end up being valid or criticized. I also thought, legitimately criticized, I also thought that there'd be some bias in the wording of the questions, and so we used multiple questions for the same thing. We used timelines. We used how long has it been since your last exposure, how often are you exposed, and I was very surprised by how much similarity there was, whether you used the matching day, the day before, or the hours on the same hour on the day before, or usual frequency, and it was improbably of the two analyses. I later thought, that's because, firstly, these effects are happening in the elderly. They have routine behaviors, quite memorable. It turned out the exposures we were mostly asking about are quite easy to remember. In other situations, I then encountered some case crossover situations where you got very different results depending on which window you chose, because their memory wasn't so good or something like that. Is there a concern about repeated events? We've already partly dealt with that. And there is something to do with repeated measures, analyses. So if the same, superficially, you might want to treat a second event in the same person as if it was independent from the first, but of course it isn't. So there are some adjustments for use of multiple events. There's a question, could I confirm that a case series analysis assumes that the outcome does not affect the exposure? Yes, the original, there have been more and more revisions of the self-controlled case series design, but the original one assumed that there was no possibility of reverse causality, and therefore it just took person time before and after before and after the outcome was just as good an estimate of the exposure odds, and in childhood vaccination studies, I think that's a fairly realistic assumption. Air pollution studies, it works as well, but so I've come up with a truncated version, and one edition of the design was a delay between the just allowing a kind of out period between the outcome and the next exposure, which would, of course, improve things, but not necessarily eliminate it. Certainly, if somebody has a heart attack and they're taken off a drug that they thought might be connected, there's a good chance for the rest of their life they're not going to be taking that drug again.
All right, Malcolm, we're at the end of the hour, and I'd like to thank you very much for the presentation. I'd like to note to the audience that the next presentation in November will be the one that was originally scheduled for today from Soto Setaguchi, linking claims data and registry information in CBR.